President, Western countries insist that they are not party to the conflict and are simply helping Ukraine defend itself. However, the reality is the polar opposite. There is a proxy war being waged with Russia in Ukraine. Since the last meeting of the Council in February on the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine, their influx has not only not decreased, but it is ever growing. Testament to this is the stance of NATO countries to the escalation. It's clear that they are not interested in any peaceful solution to the conflict whatsoever. Another pearl was said by a High Representative for the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell, who said, in order to end the war quickly, we need to stop providing military assistance to Ukraine, and Ukraine will have to surrender in a few days. That's it, war over. End of quote. The British Minister of Defence, Ben Wallace, also opened up on this topic, who said that the UK is continuing to provide military assistance to Ukraine so that other Western countries weren't tempted to force the Kiev authorities to make concessions in order to achieve peace. The delivery of more and more powerful weapon systems and their ongoing transfer of them to Kiev in order to carry out strikes, and also training of the Ukrainian armed forces on their own territory, means that these states are not only parties to the armed conflict with Russia, according to the Hague Convention from 1907 on the rights and obligations of neutral states in war, but they are also accomplices to war crimes of the UAF and nationalist battalions. The aims of the collective West are clear to everyone. Western politicians themselves don't try and hide them, and these are far from being the moral principles and high humanitarian values. They're using Ukraine as a testing site, dragging out the conflict down to the last Ukrainian in their efforts to carry out impose a strategic defeat on Russia. At the foundation of this is a clear aim to impose their will and their so-called rules on everyone. Pumping Ukraine with weapons is costing colossal amounts of money, billions of dollars from the pockets of taxpayers, which then line those of Western military industry. In last December, the US Congress approved the allocation of $48 billion for military assistance to Ukraine, and a few days ago, a new tranche of $1.2 billion was announced. Not that recently, Borrell reported that the overall assistance to Kiev from the countries and organizations of the EU alone is 16 billion euros. The same Josep Borrell proposed to allocate 3.5 billion euros for further funding of the European Peace Facility, which funds are used to pay for military deliveries to Ukraine. It's time to call a spade and rename this to the European War Facility. The Euro Commission's plan is to allocate another 1.5 billion euros for the production of ammunition. There are also reports of plans of Germany to send the biggest amount of so-called assistance to a tune of 2.7 billion euros. This assistance will include armoured vehicles, Leopard tanks, anti-aircraft weapons system, hundreds of guided missiles, intelligence drones and logistical support vehicles. Overall, in NATO countries, as is noted by the Secretary General of the organisation, Jens Stoltenberg, more than 65 billion euros has already been allocated to the Ukrainian forces. For comparison, for food security between 2021 and 2023, $18 billion were spent. Those are the real priorities, then, of the collective West. Then also the nomenclature of the deliveries is expanding, going far beyond simply defence weaponry. The European countries report that they've already sent around 600 tanks to Ukraine, and there's discussions to deliver military aircraft, fighter jets and bombers. In European countries, they also have training for crew. In Germany, according to media reports, there is training also provided for special forces. The fact that Ukraine is using the West as a being used by the West as a testing site, and the fate of the population is no concern, is illustrated by the decision of London to provide Kiev with depleted uranium shells. The UK clearly knows this, what monstrous consequences in the long term for the environment and human health these can have. Serbs still remember the bombing by NATO forces in 1999, when 15 tons of depleted uranium were used. Much documented proof of oncological diseases and other pathologies have been reported. There is direct experience of this in Iraq too, where Americans dropped hundreds of thousands of this kinds of shells. But this time the British covered themselves. The Deputy Defence Minister James Hippies hastily stated that London is not obliged to track the use of the depleted uranium shells and does not have an obligation to tackle the consequences of their use upon conclusion of the conflict. It's the same cynicism demonstrated by London and when they try to shirk responsibility for Kiev's use of British-supplied long-range systems Storm Shadow. The 12th and 13th of May, the Ukrainian Air Forces used the Storm Shadow missiles and also American rockets ADM-160B MALD on a Polypack polymer plant and a meat processing factory Milam in Lugansk. As a result of this, a fire broke out. Buildings were destroyed and there were civilian casualties, including 6 children. This didn't stop the British. They provided another 400 of these kinds of missiles and also anti-aircraft and drones with a range of more than 200 kilometers. How many of these missiles will hit civilian targets? The attacks of the Kiev regime on civilian infrastructure is a day-to-day reality in the Donbass. Donetsk is living under constant shelling since 2014. And now not a day goes by without reports of civilian casualties. Western countries are fully aware of this practice, but they never mention these cities when they talk about protection of civilians, nor when they talk about the norms of international humanitarian law. They're not in the least bit phased that these strikes are done using their weapons. We have provided many examples of the use of American HIMARS on civilian targets, and the Washington Post reported that Ukrainian civil servants said that the US de facto controls some military operations, and Kiev, as a rule, does not use Washington-provided missile systems without the confirmation or provision of coordinates by the American military. The hypocrisy of Western countries is clear here too if you take into account the direct violation of international treaties and obligations pertaining to the provision of military equipment. We spoke about this in detail during the open debate of the Security Council on the 10th of April, bringing specific examples of extremely negative consequences of this kind of violation. An end to the uncontrolled spread of weapons is something that other countries and different regions of the world have called for too. Recently, independent journalist Seymour Hersh reported that even at the early stage of the special military operation, Western-provided weapons in Ukraine were found flooding into Poland, Romania and other neighbouring countries because Ukrainian commanders on various levels are personally reselling them or leaving them behind, and then they'll end up on the black market. Even the Minister of Defence of the UK recently admitted that not all of the deliveries reached the conflict zone. We have indicated this on many occasions already, that Western weapons end up in the hands of organised crime, terrorists and armed groups, and not only in Europe, but also in other regions around the world. Western countries continue to gloss over this uncomfortable topic. They also ignore the many crimes of Zelensky's regime. There is also not attention to the direct recognition of the 16th of May of the head of the intelligence unit of the Ministry of Defence of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, who said that they reached, i.e. killed, a lot already, including public and media individuals from Russia. The terrorist heart of the Kiev regime is clear. If you in the West took the time to listen to the statements of its representatives, this is relevant for you as well. This is what was said by an advisor to the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Mikhail Podolyak, who said, and I quote, "If they stop providing weapons to Ukraine, the war will start in other countries, and then this will increase the number of terrorist attacks in Europe. Nowhere in Europe will be able to sit in a cafe and eat a croissant in peace," end of quote. And then countries in the West fully knew who exactly they brought to power as a result of the state coup in 2014, and who they carefully nurtured before this in the interests of fully transforming Ukraine into an anti-Russia. The misanthropic heart of the current Kiev regime worships Ukrainian nationalist past, which carried out monstrous crimes against the peaceful Polish, Jewish, Russian population, fully shown their true colours during the many years of war against the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. Countries in the West not only have not hindered this, but their leaders have recognized it, and they have sabotaged the Minsk agreements, which continues to use the Kiev authorities for their own interests. They still not long sight of this goal, lost sight of this goal, and as an unprecedented level of their own involvement in the conflict. Russia reserves the right to take any necessary measures to neutralise the threat to its own security, and the aims of its special military operation will be fulfilled. Thank you for your attention.